The knock on my door was sharp, urgent, slicing through the quiet hum of the evening. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a brief second a rush of irrational panic prinkled at my skin. The apartment was dimly lit, the last rays of sunlight creeping through the blinds, casting elongated shadows across the floor. With a half-finished glass of wine in one hand and my phone in the other, I crossed the room, hesitating for a heartbeat before unlocking the door. When I opened it, the sight before me was both familiar and unsettling. There he was, my nephew. He sat on the cold concrete step just outside my apartment, one elbow propped on his knee, scrolling aimlessly through his phone. A small duffel bag lay at his feet. He looked up at me, and for a moment his face was unreadable. Then, with a flicker of recognition, he smiled. "Mom said you'd help," he said casually, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. I blinked, frozen between disbelief and frustration. She didn't even call. I muttered under my breath, stepping aside to let him in. "She's been busy," he replied, dragging his bag into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing in an awkward silence that pressed against my chest. I pulled out my phone and dialed my sister. The first call went unanswered. So did the second. By the third, she finally picked up. Her voice was hurried, frazzled, and filled with that familiar mix of desperation and guilt I'd grown used to over the years. "Look, I'm sorry," she started before I could say a word. I didn't have time to explain. "Things are a mess right now. I need time. He'll only be with you for the summer." Summer. My voice rose sharply. "I can't take care of a teenager. You know how packed my schedule is." "He's not a kid anymore," she interrupted. "He's independent. He'll be fine. You won't even notice he's there." I glanced over at him. He stood in the middle of my living room, surveying the space with quiet curiosity. He didn't look like the gangly boy I remembered from years ago. At 19, he was taller than me, lean but solid, his posture far too relaxed for someone who'd just been unceremoniously dropped on a relative's doorstep. "This isn't fair," I said, lowering my voice. "Please," she said, her tone softening. "I just need this one thing from you. I'll sort everything out soon, I promise." The line went dead before I could respond. I turned back to him, exhaling slowly. "Well," I said, trying to inject some authority into my voice, "I guess you're here now." He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he gave me a half smile that bordered on him used. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm not here to make your life harder." The way he said it made me feel oddly defensive, as though I'd been accused of something without realizing it. "Your room's down the hall," I said shortly. "Second door on the right." He nodded, picked up his bag, and disappeared into the hallway. As soon as he was out of sight, I slumped into the nearest chair, my mind racing. This wasn't part of the plan. My life was meticulously organized, every hour accounted for between work errands and the quiet solitude I'd grown to rely on. Having him here disrupted all of that. A faint creak from the hallway pulled me from my thoughts. He reappeared moments later, standing just at the edge of the living one. "Thanks for letting me stay," he said, his tone quieter this time. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "It's temporary." He didn't argue. Instead, he looked around again, his gaze lingering on the bookshelves, the worn couch, the stack of papers cluttering the coffee table. "Nice place," he said simply, then disappeared back into the hallway. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this summer was going to be anything but simple. The stillness of the apartment felt heavier somehow, as though his presence had shifted the air, making it harder to breathe. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like my life was teetering on the edge of something unknown. The morning arrived quietly, with soft light filtering through my half-drawn curtains. I woke up to the faint sound of cupboards opening in the kitchen. It was strange, hearing movement that wasn't my own in an apartment I'd grown used to, keeping silent. For a moment, I thought about staying in bed, pretending it wasn't real, but curiosity and perhaps responsibility got the better of me. When I walked into the kitchen, he was there. My nephew stood by the counter, casually sipping from a mug. Steam curled lazily from it, filling the room with a sharp scent of coffee. He was dressed already, his hair slightly damp from a recent shower. It struck me again how much he'd changed since the last time I'd seen him. "Morning," he said, noticing me hover by the doorway. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. My mornings were usually mine, quiet moments spent in solitude, mentally preparing for the day. Now there was another presence, altering the atmosphere. It felt intrusive, though not intentionally so. I made some for you too, he added, gesturing toward the second mug on the counter. It was such a small gesture, but it threw me off. I couldn't remember the last time anyone had made me coffee. It felt oddly personal. Thanks, I said, crossing the room to pick it up. The mug was warm in my hands, and I took a cautious sip. It was perfect, rich and smooth, not the bitter instant stuff I usually rush through. I figured you could use a proper cup, he said casually as if reading my mind. You don't seem like the type to make time for that. I frowned at the remark. What's that supposed to mean? He shrugged, his expression neutral. Just an observation. His calmness unnerved me. He seemed so sure of himself, so composed in a way that didn't match my memory of him. I wanted to push back to remind him that this was my space, my life, but I didn't. Instead, I sipped the coffee in silence, feeling the weight of his presence more acutely than ever. The rest of the day passed without much interaction. I went to work, throwing myself into my routine, in the hopes of shaking the strange feeling that had settled over. When I came home, the apartment was quiet again. His shoes were by the door, a reminder that I wasn't alone, but he was nowhere to be seen. It was only later, as I settled onto the couch with my laptop, that he reappeared. He leaned against the doorway to the living room, his posture relaxed but his gaze oddly intent. Busy day, he asked. I glanced up, startled by the sudden intrusion. Yes, I said curtly, hoping he'd take the hint and leave me to my work. Instead, he walked into the room and sat on the armrest of the couch, just within my peripheral vision. You always work this late? Yes, I said again, more sharply this time. It's part of the job. He didn't reply immediately, and for a moment I thought he might drop the subject. But then he said, "Doesn't leave much room for anything else, does it?" I set my laptop aside, suddenly irritated. What are you getting at? He smiled faintly, as if amused by my reaction. Nothing. Just seems like you could use a break now, and then. The audacity of it caught me off guard. I don't need advice from you, I said, my tone harsher than I intended. He raised his hands in mock surrender. All right, just making conversation. For a moment we sat there in silence, the tension thick between us. I was about to tell him to leave when he spoke again. You've changed, you know, he said quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I stared at him, unsure of what to say. What did he mean? Changed how? Before I could respond, he stood up and crossed the room. For a moment he paused, his eyes meeting mine. Then without another word, he leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to my cheek. It was so quick, so unexpected that I barely had time to react. By the time I realized what had happened, he was already heading back to his room. Good night, he said over his shoulder, his voice calm and steady. I sat there for a long time after he left, my mind racing. It wasn't just the kiss, it was everything about him. The way he carried himself, the way he looked at me as if he understood things I hadn't even admitted to myself. It was unsettling, confusing, and for reasons I couldn't fully explain. It lingered with me long after I went to bed. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over in my mind. It wasn't just what he'd done, it was how he'd done it. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was as if he'd been completely sure of himself, of me, in a way that left me questioning everything. I came home that evening, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on me. The office had been relentless, and my only thought as I climbed the stairs to my apartment was of the quiet sanctuary waiting on the other side of the door. Instead, I was met with muffled laughter and the distinct thud of loud music coming from inside. I paused in the hallway, my hand hovering over the doorknob. For a brief moment, I wondered if I'd walked into the wrong building. But no, this was my apartment, my key fit, and the sounds of what was unmistakably a party confirmed my growing suspicion. Pushing the door open, I was greeted by chaos. Shoes cluttered the entryway, jackets draped over the back of my dining chairs, and unfamiliar voices echoing from the hallway leading to his room. Dropping my bag onto the nearest surface, I made my way down the hall. His door was slightly ajar, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of several people talking over each other, punctuated by bursts of laughter. I knocked once, loud enough to be heard over the noise, before pushing the door open. Inside there were 3 of them. My nephew sat on the edge of his bed, a half-smile playing on his lips as he gestured animatedly to his friends. The other 2, a boy and a girl, were sprawled out on the floor, surrounded by empty cans of soda and snack wrappers. The air was thick with the smell of chips and oversweetened energy drinks. I stood in the doorway, my arms crossed, and waited for someone to acknowledge my presence. When no one did, I cleared my throat. "Hey," I said sharply. "Can we keep it down a little? I just got home and I need some peace and quiet." My nephew looked up, his expression calm but amused, as though I just asked them to turn water into wine. "Sure," he said with a nod, though his tone didn't match the promise. I stayed there for a half beat longer, narrowing my eyes at him before turning and walking back down the hall. The noise continued, barely muffled by the walls. I tried to distract myself by cleaning up the mess in the kitchen, then settling on the couch with my laptop. But the sounds of laughter and thumping music kept breaking my focus. For the second time that evening, I got up and marched down the hallway. I knocked again, harder this time, and didn't bother waiting for a response before opening the door. "I thought we agreed to keep it down," I said, my voice firmer now. He looked at me again, this time, with a flicker of irritation. "We're just talking, not doing anything crazy. Talking doesn't usually sound like a nightclub," I shot back. One of his friends snickered, and I caught the girl whispering something to him, her eyes glancing at me briefly before they both laughed. My nephew didn't say anything, just shrugged, which only fueled my frustration. "I mean it," I said, my tone rising. "Keep it down." And once again I turned on my heel and left. By the time I went back to my laptop, my nerves were frayed. The noise persisted, as if my earlier interruptions had done nothing but amuse them. The music was louder now, laughter more frequent, and I could hear the bass vibrating faintly through the walls. I tried to ignore it, gripping the edges of my laptop and pretending the words on the screen were worth my attention. But it didn't last. By the third time I marched down that hall, I wasn't knocking. The door flew open with more force than I intended, startling all three of them. My nephew looked up at me, clearly annoyed now, but I didn't give him a chance to speak. "I've already come in here twice," I said sharply, my voice trembling with pent-up anger. "This is the third time I've asked you to quiet down. You're guests in my home, and I shouldn't have to remind you to be respectful." His friends exchanged awkward glances. The girl whispered something under her breath, and this time I didn't care what it was. My nephew just stared at me, his calm demeanor now tinged with something else, defiance. "We'll tone it down," he said finally, his tone clipped. I stood there for a second longer, letting the silence settle uncomfortably, before I walked out and shut the door behind me. For a while the apartment was quieter, but it didn't last. The music crept up again, softer but still noticeable, accompanied by occasional bursts of that laughter. By the fourth time I didn't knock, I pushed the door open, my patience long gone. "Can you stop this already?" I snapped, my voice louder than I realized. The room fell silent. All three of them looked at me, stunned into a momentary pause. I stood in the doorway, my arms crossed, glaring at them. "I've asked you 3 times, to keep it down," I said, emphasizing each word. "This is my home and I need it quiet." Now my nephew's expression shifted, softening slightly. He glanced at his friends and gave a small nod. "All right," he said, his tone more serious this time. "We'll stop." I didn't linger to see if he meant it. Turning on my heel, I walked back to the living room, my heart pounding. For the first time that evening, the noise finally stopped. Sitting back down on the couch, I exhaled slowly, trying to let go of the tension that had been building all night. It wasn't until much later, when the apartment was completely still, that I realized the silence felt just as unsettling as the noise had. The sunlight crept through the blinds, painting thin lines across the kitchen counter. I poured my coffee with the precision of someone trying to delay the inevitable. My conversation with him. The silence in the apartment now felt fragile, like a bubble that might burst at the first sound. I heard his door open before I saw him. His footsteps were unhurried, and when he appeared in the kitchen, his hair was tousled, and he looked as calm as if the previous night hadn't happened. He didn't acknowledge me immediately, heading straight for the cupboard to grab a mug. "Morning," he said casually, his tone completely neutral, as if we hadn't gone through a mini-acre war of wills just hours earlier. I placed my mug on the counter and crossed my arms, staring at him as he poured himself some coffee. "Morning," I said, my tone clipped. He looked up, noticing my expression. "What?" he asked, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips, like he already knew what was coming. I raised an eyebrow. "You're seriously going to act like nothing happened last night?" His smile widened, but he said nothing, taking a slow sip of coffee instead. I was in shock. I continued, my voice rising slightly. You and your friends were so loud I could hear every word, every laugh, and that music. Don't even get me started on the music. He leaned back against the counter, holding his mug with both hands, his expression still maddeningly composed. We weren't that bad, he said, shrugging lightly. Not that bad. I repeated, my voice incredulous. I came into your room 3 times to ask you to keep it down, and you still didn't listen. 3 times, and it just got louder every time. His gaze softened slightly, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of guilt. Okay, he said, his tone more subdued. I admit we might have gotten carried away. I placed my hands on my hips, refusing to let him off the hook so easily. Carried away. You and your friends turned this place into a nightclub. I don't know how you didn't expect me to lose my patience. He sighed, setting his mug down on the counter. I get it, I'm sorry. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. I narrowed my eyes, searching his face for sincerity. You'd better mean that, I said firmly. He nodded, looking me straight in the eye. I do. The rest of the morning passed quietly. He retreated to his room after our conversation, and I took the time to tidy up the living room. The evidence of last night's chaos was everywhere. A crumpled blanket on the couch, an empty soda can have hidden under the coffee table, a plate with crumbs left behind on the side table. I cleaned methodically, trying to focus on the task and not the lingering irritation in my chest. But as I placed the last pillow back on the couch, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. It wasn't just the noise that had bothered me. It was his calmness, his ability to deflect and downplay the situation as if it were no big deal. Later that afternoon, he emerged from his room, his demeanor completely unchanged. Do you need anything from the store? He asked casually, as if nothing had happened. I stared at him for a moment, caught off guard by the question. No, I said slowly. Why? I was going to pick up a few things, he said, shrugging. Thought I'd ask. His nonchalance was disarming. For a brief moment, I wondered if I'd overreacted. Maybe it really hadn't been as bad as I'd thought. But then I remembered the 4th time I'd had to walk into his room, my frustration boiling over, and I felt my irritation flare up. Again. Just make sure you actually keep things quiet next time, I said, my tone firm. He nodded. Understood. By evening, the apartment had settled into an unusual calm. He stayed in his room for most of the day, and I found myself pacing the living room feeling restless. The confrontation that morning had left me unsettled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't handling this situation well. When he finally emerged again, it was with a new air of lightness. I made dinner, he said, gesturing toward the kitchen. I blinked. You what? Dinner, he repeated, a faint smirk playing on his lips. It's not much, but I figured it's the least I could do after last night. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed him into the kitchen. On the counter there was a simple spread: pasta, salad, and a loaf of bread he'd clearly picked up at the store. It was nothing fancy, but the gesture caught me off guard. You didn't have to do this, I said, my voice softer now. I know, he replied, but I wanted to. For the first time all day, the tension between us eased. We sat down to eat, and for a while the conversation was light and easy. He told me about his plans for the week, and I shared a few stories from work. Felt almost normal, almost comfortable. As the night wore on, I found myself reflecting on the day. Despite the rocky start, there was something about his presence that had begun to shift the dynamic of the apartment. It was still strange, still unsettling at times, but it wasn't all bad. As I cleared the dishes from the table, he leaned against the counter, watching me with a faint smile. So he said, breaking the silence, "Are we good now?" I looked at him, surprised by the question. "I guess," I said, my lips twitching into a reluctant smile. He grinned. "Good. I'll try not to get on your nerves too much." I rolled my eyes, but there was no real heat behind it. "Just keep it down. Next time," I said, shaking my head. "Deal," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. And with that, the unease of the day finally began to fade. The following week passed in a blur, but the strange undercurrent in the apartment didn't dissipate. The night of the party lingered in the back of my mind. Not just because of the noise, but because of the calm, unbothered way he'd handled everything. He was young, sure, but there was something almost practiced in how he navigated our confrontations. Like he always knew just how far to push without going over the edge. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, I came home to find the apartment unusually quiet. The absence of sound was almost unsettling. I dropped my bag by the door and kicked off my shoes, glancing around. His shoes were neatly placed by the wall, a subtle reminder that he was home. "Hey," I called out, my voice echoing slightly. In here came his reply, muffled but clear enough to lead me to the living room. He was stretched out on the couch, a book in his hands. It wasn't something I'd expected. He usually spent his evenings out or glued to his phone. The sight of him engrossed in a novel made me pause. "You read?" I asked, genuinely curious. He looked up, smirking slightly. "Everyone reads. You think I'm illiterate?" I rolled my eyes but smiled despite myself. Surprising. What's the book?" He held it up, showing me the cover. It was a classic I'd read years ago, one I remembered loving but hadn't touched since college. "Interesting choice," I said, moving to sit on the armchair opposite him. "It's good," he replied. "Makes you think." I leaned back, watching him for a moment. He didn't seem like the kind of person to sit still long enough to get through a book like that. But there he was, turning the pages with a calm focus that didn't fit the image I'd built of him in my head. Later that evening, as I was finishing up some work at the kitchen table, he appeared again. This time, he leaned against the counter, watching me with a look that I couldn't quite decipher. "Long day?" he asked. "Always," I replied, not looking up from my laptop. "You work too much," he said, his tone light but edged with something more. "I work enough," I countered. "You're always like this," he said, crossing his arms. "Like the world's going to fall apart if you don't keep everything perfectly in line." His words caught me off guard, but I tried not to show it. "That's how life works," I said. "You don't get things by sitting around and hoping they fall into your lap." He tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "And when was the last time you let yourself just enjoy something?" I scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "I enjoy things all the time. Name one." The challenge in his tone irritated me. "I don't need to justify myself to you," I said, finally looking up. His expression didn't change, if anything had softened. "I'm not asking you to," he said. "I'm just saying maybe you don't have to try so hard all the time." The words hung in the air between us, heavier than I expected. I wanted to brush them off, to tell him he didn't know what he was talking about. But the truth was, they struck a nerve. The next day, I came home to find a small note taped to the fridge. It was written in his slightly messy handwriting. "Dinner's on the table. Don't work too late." I frowned, pulling the note off and glancing toward the dining table. Sure enough, there was a plate covered with foil. It was a simple meal, pasta, salad, and bread, but the gesture caught me off guard. When he came out of his room later that evening, I confronted him. "What's this about?" I asked, holding up the note. He shrugged. "You were late. Figured you'd forget to eat otherwise." His tone was casual, but there was something deeper behind it. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the unspoken things we both avoided talking about. "You don't have to take care of me," I said, my voice softer now. "I know," he replied, "but maybe someone should." As the week went on, I found myself noticing more of these little gestures. A cup of tea left for me in the morning. The trash taken out without me asking. Even small things like folding the blanket on the couch after I'd left it in a heap. They were quiet, almost invisible actions, but they added up. It wasn't until Friday evening that the tension finally broke. I came home to find him sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of water in his hand. He looked up when I entered, his expression serious. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I hesitated but nodded, setting my bag down on the counter. "What is it? Are you happy?" The question was so blunt, so unexpected that I froze. "What kind of question is that?" He didn't flinch. "Just curious." I forced a laugh, trying to brush it off. "Of course I'm happy. Why wouldn't I be?" His gaze didn't waver. "You don't seem like it." I stared at him, the words sticking in my throat. He didn't say anything else, didn't press me for an answer. He just waited, his expression calmed but unyielding. And for the first time, I didn't know what to say. That night as I lay in bed, his question echoed in my mind. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he'd said them, like he already knew the answer. And maybe deep down, I did too. The weekend arrived with an unusual stillness. The air in the apartment felt heavier, almost charged, like the moments before a storm. I woke up later than usual, the sunlight already spilling through the curtains. And for the first time in what felt like weeks, the apartment was silent. As I shuffled into the kitchen, I found him already awake, sitting at the table with his usual mug of coffee. He looked up as I entered, offering a faint smile. There was something different in his expression, softer, quieter, as though he'd been waiting for me to appear. "Morning," he said, his voice calm. Morning, I replied, heading straight for the coffee pot. The routine of it was grounding, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. We sat in silence for a while, each of us lost in our thoughts. It wasn't until I glanced up that I noticed he was watching me, his gaze steady and thoughtful. "What?" I asked, setting my mug down. He hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice measured. "Maybe this hasn't been the easiest for you. Having me here, I blinked, caught off guard. "It's fine," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. He gave me a look that said, he didn't believe me. "You don't have to pretend. I know I've made things complicated." I opened my mouth to argue, but he held up a hand to stop me. "It's okay," he said quickly. "I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I think it's time I figure things out on my own." The words hung in the air heavier than I expected. My first instinct was to agree to tell him that he was right, that it was time for him to go. But instead, all I felt was a strange, inexplicable H. "You don't have to leave," I said, surprising even myself. His eyebrows lifted slightly, but his expression remained calm. "It's not about needing to leave," he said. "It's about what's best for both of us." I frowned, my chest tightening. "You think I don't want you here?" "No," he said simply. "I think you're afraid to want anyone here." The statement hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just the truth of it. It was the way he said it, with no malice, no judgment, just quiet understanding. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "You think you have me all figured out?" I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. "No," he said, "but I think I understand you more than you realize." The honesty in his voice made it impossible to argue. For a long moment, we sat there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. Later that evening, as I cleared the dishes from dinner, he appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, watching me with that same unreadable expression. "I'm heading out for a bit," he said. "Where to?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Just for a walk," he replied. "Clear my head." I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. He lingered for a moment longer, as though waiting for me to stop him, but I stayed silent. When the door closed behind him, the apartment felt impossibly quiet. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty space where he'd been. Hours passed and he didn't return. Anxiety knotted me, each passing minute stretching into an eternity. I tried calling, but his phone went straight to voicemail. It wasn't until just past midnight that the sound of the door unlocking jolted me from my restless pacing. He stepped inside, looking tired but otherwise fine. "Sorry," he said immediately, noticing my expression. I lost track of time. I exhaled sharply, the tension in my chest finally breaking. "You could have called. I didn't think you'd care that much," he admitted, his tone light, but there was something deeper behind his words. I didn't answer right away, too caught up in the flood of relief and frustration. Finally, I looked at him and said, "Of course I care." He froze, clearly not expecting the response. For a moment, he just stared at me, his eyes searching mine. Then quietly he said, "I'm glad." That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself replaying the events of the day. His words echoed in my mind, intertwining with all the small moments that had come before. I realized something then, something I hadn't wanted to admit even to myself. He hadn't just disrupted my life. He'd reminded me of what it meant to let someone in, to share my space, my time, my world. And while it scared me, it also felt right. As sleep finally began to pull me under, I whispered to the empty room, "Maybe I needed this more than I thought." And for the first time in years, the silence felt comforting.